introduction, and also thank you for inviting me out here to speak at Utrecht. Am I pronouncing that right, or I'm trying? Still working on the Dutch. So this first presentation, we're going to be looking at ways to extend Spring Boot for the enterprise. And just also quickly, my own introduction is, my name is Billy Korando. I'm a developer advocate with IBM. You can find me at Billy Korando on Twitter. And also you can feel free to email me at williamkorando@ibm.com. So if you have questions about this presentation or about anything kind of particularly IBM cloud related, feel free to email me, and if I don't know the answer, I'll definitely connect you with someone who might know that answer. But I will definitely respond to any emails you send to me. I am definitely committed to helping out people when needed, just because I've been in that situation where I'm like, I'm stuck, I can't figure it out, I'm trying to remember something. So it's important that I help other people out. It's important to me at least. So that said, a couple other things we're working on. My team, the Global Java Developer Advocacy team, we started a new newsletter recently. So we kind of want to keep up on what's going on in the Java world. For example, we just had the big, I guess, kerfluffle, if you want to call it that, with Jakarta EE over the Java X namespace. So I'm sure that's probably going to be a part of our next newsletter. But you can also just kind of keep up on what's going on with what's coming in the next Java release, Java 13, which will be here in September. We'll probably be talking about that, and so on. Also, if you're thinking of migrating to the cloud, we also have some great documentation for both Spring and Jakarta EE and micro profile within that. Of course, we're going to be using IBM Cloud as the implementation detail, but a lot of that practices and stuff can actually translate to whatever cloud platform you might be using. So, some good information there. And lastly, IBM is going to be hosting Developer Night. I think it's going to be primarily kind of focused on IoT, machine learning, blockchain, and some stuff like that. So if you're interested in checking them out, follow that link, ibm.biz at DevNight2019, if you want to have a night of fun. All right, and then finally, I blog a lot, and also I'm starting this new series I'm really interested in called Living on the Cloud. That's kind of all about deploying or building applications with Spring Boot, and then kind of building and maintaining those applications in a cloud world. And you can kind of find out those links. The second link is going to be heading to that series, and then I also blog a lot on my own personal website on various things. A lot of automated testing, but also a lot on Spring Boot. All right, so what are we going to be covering in this first presentation? So there's three major kind of concepts and topics. The first is Spring Boot philosophy. So a lot of this presentation is kind of like a lot of other ways, there are approaches that Spring has, or Spring team and Spring Boot team had in designing Spring Boot, I think has a lot of meaning and translation into the enterprise world. So we're going to kind of look and understand some of the design philosophies behind Spring Boot, and then how we can maybe abstract them out or extend them out into the Java or into our own workplace. And then we're going to be take a closer look at how we can improve project management. By project management, I don't mean the project manager, but project management kind of around our build files and stuff like that. How can we kind of improve it to make them more legible and understandable? Because I've kind of ran into that a few times where they're a mess and it's not so much fun. And then also, how can we improve project initialization? At a lot of organizations I've been at, that has been a very painful process. How can we kind of make it a little bit less painful, or maybe actually almost pleasant? So we'll look at that as well. So a little bit about me. So this isn't me trying to aggrandize myself, but mostly about how I have this shared experience and sometimes painful experience developing applications in a enterprise world. So a little over 10 years of experience now. And during that time, I've worked at some really fun places like insurance regulation, electronic health records, shipping, finance, and government, before now making the switch to developer advocacy pretty late last year. But kind of from that experience, I've always kind of learned it seems like it can be somewhat difficult developing applications starting them up, getting them deployed to production, and so on. And it's like, this shouldn't be easier. And it was pretty consistent experience across all these organizations. So I was like, okay, this isn't just a case of like the one organization I worked at. It's a pretty general experience. And something I kind of learned over my career is that software development in of itself, when you're actually building and writing an application, you know, that's reasonably pleasant. At least that's going to be the most fun and interesting part of our job. Business person comes to you and, you know, says, hey, we need this new thing, or, you know, we're going to start this new project. To figuring out the design process in that can be kind of fun and interesting. However, much around software development can often be a very painful experience. Kind of like I was mentioning, starting a new project, you know, maybe trying to get some new tables or something added to a database, setting up some stuff. Like that infrastructure stuff, all that stuff can be a very painful experience, at least it has been in my experience. I saw a really good quote here on a tweet. Engineers, we don't generally hate process, we just hate process that can't really defend itself. We've all kind of been to places where, you know, maybe something went wrong like years ago, and since then we've all had to like go through like some sort of process now just to make sure, you know, it's like that thing doesn't happen again, even though that process just like no longer even really relates back to like what it was trying to prevent in the first place. But yeah, a lot of times it's just like a lot of these manual processes just get layered upon layered upon layered at organizations, and it just can make it incredibly painful to really try to do anything new, to the point where those processes is just, they don't try to actually, you know, resolve issues or prevent issues from happening, they just prevent any sort of progress from happening, and maybe in that way they stop stuff from happening, you know, maybe bugs from getting production, but that's really probably weren't their intended goal to do that, to make people not want to do anything. So, how can we learn from Spring? How can we kind of figure some stuff out that can maybe address this? So as I mentioned, I've been developing for a little over 10 years now. About 8 or 9 of those years I've been working with Spring, and about 4 or 5 years ago I started using Spring Boot. And so that first 4 or 5 years I was working with Spring before I started using Spring Boot, it was definitely an improvement over what we had before. I was using like struts or some sort of like roll your own framework, and project initialization and stuff was really painful. It was very difficult to manage these projects. Switching to Spring, at the time it was like Spring 2, 2.5. It was a little bit better, but you know, it was also sometimes kind of painful. It required those, if people have been doing Spring for a long time, you know, going back to the time when everything was configured in XML files. I remember having a bunch of application.context XML files just all floating around in the application. It's just like, keep throwing beans and stuff like that until it works. So sometimes the Spring projects would be a little bit better, but they were kind of painful, and at least even just getting a project initially going could take quite a while. I remember just even getting like your very basic RESTful application running in a Spring application, it might almost take a week, and a lot of times you maybe just copy over from another project, but then you kind of have like a bunch of stuff maybe that needed for that project, but you don't need it in another one. So this is where then I learned about Spring Boot, and this was kind of my initial reaction. Has anybody seen Josh Long present before? A couple? So yeah, I got my introduction to Spring Boot from Josh Long. If you've seen any of his presentations, you know, he starts off his presentation, you know, going to start.spring.io, and he'd go from having like no project to like having a web RESTful API that's talking to a database that's doing messaging and doing all these things. It's just kind of like, wow, you know, that's amazing. He's doing more work in this hour and a half presentation that it feels like it can accomplish in a week, sometimes even a month. So seeing that was extremely impressive, and I was wondering like, how can I get that at my organization? And so the way that this is actually able to happen is that Spring is opinionated. And a good way of showing this is Phil Webb, who is the lead on the Spring Boot project. I guess was responding to some sort of criticism of Spring Boot, and so what he describes Spring Boot as is that if Spring Framework is a raw cake, or all the raw ingredients to a cake, then Spring Boot is an actually made cake. But in many ways, I don't feel like this does Spring Boot justice, because like you kind of look like this and you maybe take it a little too literally, which never happens on the internet, people taking something overly literally. You might say like, oh, well, Spring Boot, okay, fine, you get the cake, but it's going to be a chocolate cake with frostings and crushed M&Ms on top, and if that's not what you want, you're just going to be out of luck. You're going to have to do something completely different, or you're just going to work really, really hard to have some other type of cake. But that's not my experience at all. So, of course, with Spring, you're going to get cake. You're going to get Spring because it is, of course, Spring Boot, but you have a lot of say in the kind of cake that you want. So if you want to do an angel food cake, so if you want to do a Spring reactive app that talks to a MongoDB database in the back end, that's easy to do. You're not having to completely reconfigure stuff to do that. And you could also be like using Netty instead. Maybe you just have a carrot cake, and okay, well that's just talking to a Postgres database using Tomcat, and you're using Log4j2 instead of Logbag or something. That's a pretty easy change to make, and the analogy can kind of continue. Spring Boot, it doesn't just hammer you into the ground with the way necessarily to do things. It's like, okay, here's some ways to do some things to kind of get you going, based upon our experience, based upon the feedback. This is generally the way developers want to develop an application. But if you want to go something different, if you want to kind of change some of those default behaviors, well, that's also pretty easy to change as well. You're not just going to be forced into doing the things this exact way. Generally, Spring Boot is pretty good about stepping back and allowing you to go a different way when you want to. So in that way, it's opinionated, but it's not oppressive in those opinions. And that kind of also leads into that what we want to do is have guide signs, because I've also been part of teams and projects where we were having this kind of trouble, where it's just like, it was just taking too long to start a new application, so we were trying to find ways to make it easier to start an application, but we were just really, really overly opinionated or very forceful in our opinions to where, you're having to use these libraries at these specific versions and doing these things in this specific way, and it was just a frustrating experience. We want to have a way to guide people to say, okay, these are the ways we do things at our organization. If you want to connect to a database, okay, like here's ways of doing that, but being able to step back if someone wants to do something different, so that way we can still encourage innovation and change and maybe improving ways on how we have it. So you want guide signs, not guide rails or guide rails, where it's a terrible idea, but we have to do it this way, and we're just going to go right into the ocean. I was actually one point recently, within about the past year, was asked to write security using Spring Security in Spring Security 3.x, which was end of life like 2 years ago. And I mean, it's a ludicrous proposal. You're basically like, it's asking me to like write security with like a gate where you can just kind of reach around and then just unlock it from the other side, because it's end of life. There's no longer going to be any security patches for it. So like there's these absurd security holes which are inevitably found. So that kind of process, that kind of mentality, where we're forcing people to make these bad decisions or we can't change, that's not useful at all. But overall, though, what we want to do with these guide signs, with kind of guiding people along the right path, is reserving mental capacity. A really great speaker, if you get a chance to see her, I think she sometimes comes over to Europe, is Jessica Kerr. She's with Adamus. But I remember watching her presentation, and that's one of the things she talked about, what she was talking about Adamus, is finding ways to reserve mental capacity. There's a lot of basic things, that go on, like setting up, like say, a Git repository for your new project, setting up a space with maybe your issue trackers and so on and all that stuff. That stuff needs to be there, but we can find a way to kind of automate those processes so you're not spending so much time thinking about it. That's going to preserve your mental capacity for things that actually matter to your organization, building out new features that your customers and clients are going to use. Your customers and clients don't care whether you're using GitHub issues or Jira trackers or whatever. You know, they care about things they can actually interact with, so we can actually have developers and or the organization itself spending more time thinking about how to improve that versus how to get a new database set up. That's going to be a huge one, or how to connect to an existing database. But that said, you know, a lot of these things, I have opinions. They're of course always right. Actually, well, they're not always right. There's supposed to be a joke in there. I can get rid of that one. Actually, never disagree with me. That's always right. No. So just kind of review just this section. Kind of this concept is actually what it's called, is convention over configuration. So in short, is this: don't require developers to make more decisions than they have to. You know, if there's a reasonable configuration that they can use or set up, then let them do that. But then also be flexible with it. Allow developers to easily change that. You know, again, going back to Spring Boot, you know, by default, it's just going to be running in port 8080. A developer doesn't have to configure that. But if they want to use something different, you know, it's just easily saying server.port and then setting it to whatever else you need it to be. Make it very easy to change when the default doesn't necessarily work for them. And again, the whole goal is preserving mental capacity. Are these changes, are these opinions going to actually save people time, or is it just, you know, forcing opinions on someone and it doesn't really actually help anything? All right, so that's just kind of like some of the, a bit of the Spring Boot philosophy. Also, if at any point anybody has a question, you know, this is a meetup, so we have a pretty generous timeline, or not a strict timeline like we would at a conference, so feel free to ask them at any point. And of course, yes?
So what if conventions change over time?
What was that?
What if conventions change over time?
So actually we'll kind of get a little bit into that with this project management, how we can maybe kind of easily handle kind of changing some of this stuff, because you're absolutely right, sometimes those opinions, those conventions kind of change over time, and yeah, it's be a good way within like the project, particularly initialization, how we can maybe easily get those changes out there that don't require a lot of work. Yeah, great question.
Are there also guidelines to perform migrations?
Sorry?
Guidelines to perform migrations from workflow to workflow.
Integrations from one offering to like migrations.
Yeah.
I don't quite get into that depth on this presentation, at least. Yeah, I mean, sometimes that can be still hard to manage. And I'll kind of touch, again, a little bit in some ways on that, on how you can kind of provide ways where, like, okay, this is like a new way of doing things, without, that can make it a little bit easier to kind of propagate that information. So we may touch on it a bit later, and if not, we can kind of talk about it a little bit after the end of this presentation for that question at least. So for improving project management, so one area, been a lot of organizations where, you know, you want to have people using maybe specific versions of libraries, and so things like that, or you may have these kind of shared and starter libraries where you have these, whatever concepts you have at an organization, you kind of want to share them. And a lot of these things, you know, it becomes overbearing, it becomes very complex from maybe like an architectural or whoever team you have kind of handling it, to kind of manage this information. And so there's a lot of ways that kind of you can see in Spring Boot where we can follow it on how we can kind of improve these practices. So we're going to be kind of looking at using parent comms effectively, starter or shared libraries, and leveraging auto configuration. And so the goals of this, to keep project build files more simple, keep projects easier to maintain for both the teams that are actually building and maintaining these projects or products or whatever kind of term you want to use for them, but also from like an enterprise and architectural perspective, kind of making sure, as we kind of to your point, as maybe conventions and standards change, that information can be easily passed along or, handed out that isn't, doesn't require huge lifts on both sides. And also it'd be great that as you go into a build file, maybe you're a new developer coming in, or maybe you're at like an architectural or enterprise level kind of looking down a project to make sure it's maybe following certain guidelines, you can maybe kind of look at the build file and be like, oh, okay, maybe you're not bringing something in. Like it's somewhat descriptive of what's going on within the project, its capabilities and responsibilities. So often, I think the many organizations and teams are even using Spring Boot, and I would go into this build file, and it would just kind of go on and on and on, and you fall asleep, and then you wake up at the very bottom, and you'd be like, wait, what just happened? I have project build files that would be, probably over 1,000 lines long, and at that point, you just you have no idea really what's going on in the project. And to like a specific point I actually ran into, I was working at an organization as a consultant, and I was trying to talk to this RESTful web service or something. And long story short is that like the model file didn't quite match up with like how the names are designed for what it was actually communicating with, because it was using like hyphens within the name, which can't really do within Java. So I was having to annotate that model file with Jackson annotations. And so I went in and just looked it up and put it all in there, and it looked like it should work, but it wasn't working. And I spent like 2 or 3 days trying to figure out why it wasn't the same working. And the reason why it wasn't working was because I think I was using the 1.x Jackson annotations, and because 2.x was also in there, that was what was actually preferred by Spring Boot, or it could have been the vice versa. But regardless, is that the previous developer unknowingly put both versions of Jackson in there, and so it just took a while because the build file was so huge I couldn't easily recognize that. And this is also why confusion is that a lot of times you're kind of always forcing developers to kind of figure everything out themselves, and so you just like keep throwing dependencies. Sometimes you keep throwing beans into a Spring project until it works, or sometimes people keep throwing dependencies within a POM XML or a Gradle build file until it works. So how can we prove that? So why does this happen? Yeah, enterprises have a lot of demands, security, logging, so on. These demands, they can somewhat change fairly often, and a lot of times there can be some lack of guidelines on how to do things right. It's like, oh, we connect to a Postgres database, but then it's not like, okay, well, what version should I be bringing in? It's just like, well, just go get whatever version's out there, whatever you can find on Haven Central, and then put that in there. That's not a great way of doing things. And so sometimes maybe a way of handling this is what I like to call is a genealogy of parent build files. I've worked with a couple organizations that try to maybe approach a way of governance through this. And so what we would have is some super POM way at the top. And from there, because we are very, smug, and we have, we pretentious, we have to have our own parent. So we have the super parent and then the architecture parent. But then below that, okay, well, we're gonna have like a lot of web jobs, and we're gonna have a lot of batch projects. So we have to have parent POMs for both of those, of course. And well, from there, some web projects, have to be a little bit different, so they have the alternative web projects. And then there's like one other team, well, okay, they had to have their own parent web project for whatever reason. And then, okay, for batch jobs, well, we have some internal ones and some external ones, and so we had to split that up as well. And so, okay, well, a change here means like all of a sudden, we needed to kick off 7 builds to get all that stuff incorporated at the in all the parents. And then sometimes we would have like a change here. Okay, do we rebuild like the parent and then everything down below it as well to keep everything in sync? And I mean, I remember when I was working at a team where we were doing this, like I think half the time I was spent running Jenkins jobs on all these parent builds just to kind of keep everything in sync. It was ridiculous. And of course then for, all the teams down here where they're actually, consuming this stuff, it was a constantly frustrating experience of like, wait, what version should we be on now? And, constantly sending out emails saying like, hey, I'll take to this next version and stuff. And of course, understandably, they would start to ignore you because that was just too much work to constantly have to be worrying about their version numbers. They had other stuff to do. So yeah, how can we address this? But we still need to have some sort of governance just so we know, like, okay, when you're maybe doing security, being on the most recent version of security, there, potentially had security holes and so on like that. So you can manage them instead of just hardcore declaring them. So this can be done with the dependency management concepts within Maven. I know they also kind of have it in Gradle. I'm a Maven person, but I know there's like some sort of analog because this works both for Gradle and Maven projects. Anyways, so what you can do is you can set like properties and you say like, oh, okay, Spring Security Starter version 1.0, and then down here, you can just say that's their version, but then when some person brings in like Security Starter within their project, it'll be at the 1.0 version. They don't have to figure out the version to set it. But then also, it's not forcing them to bring in that if they, for some reason, they don't need that dependency. So it's there to set it to the correct version, but it doesn't require that version to, or that dependency to be there if they're not actually going to use it. Yes?
But how does this really solve the problem?
Well, so you can kind of, I'll show you here in a moment, that you can kind of like lessen it down with a couple of other changes as well. So you don't have to try to cram every dependency into the parent POM, and then you can use you can use these bombs to handle different dependencies for different domains and project types. So, so this is kind of a little bit. This is a little bit managed. If you use like Spring Cloud, like they have their own dependency POM that can handle all the dependencies that are Spring Cloud dependencies, that you can bring that into that when you're using Spring Cloud. So instead of trying to cram all those also managed dependencies of Spring Cloud within like the Spring Boot, they kind of separated that out. And so you can kind of do that also, so you're not kind of forcing to cram everything in there. So yeah, like for example, if you have a bunch of batch dependencies for, oh yes.
But how will it solve, again, well, how will it solve the Jackson problem? You need to be aware that they use Jackson 1 in the first place, right?
Yes, so I'll be getting to that here in just a moment to kind of help start answering that question. So, okay. Yeah, this is it is a good question, and I do kind of get to that point of answering it. So, but yeah, setting up that with these dependency management, and so what you can kind of do then with that is by using bombs and stuff instead, you can break up, you don't have to have such a hierarchical dependency between all these projects. Instead, you can kind of keep, because like there's not a hierarchical dependency, for example, between Spring Cloud dependencies and Spring Boot. They can evolve at their own pace and their own rate. When Spring Boot does a release, it's not necessarily kicking off a release within Spring Cloud. Now, kind of maybe some of the questions you're kind of getting to, is to be able to offer opinionated takes on some of these dependencies you want to bring in. And so what that is, a lot of times comes down to like bundling and auto configuration. It's really pretty obvious, and actually sometimes a lot of organizations already do it, but just bundle things that make sense that go together. So if you're doing database stuff, if you're doing Spring Data or using Spring Data JDC or whatever, or just have a Spring or your org data starter and bundle that stuff together. And that kind of gets to the Jackson thing, is that you're not necessarily, or also for like caching and so on, is that you're not necessarily forcing a developer to go out and make all these decisions if they're doing like web work. Jackson's actually already pulled in by default, and that's just a case of the developer not knowing. But if you can have these available libraries out there for like doing whatever kind of work, you're not making a developer thinking like they're going to go out and get whatever library to do like what specific thing. And through that, that's kind of how you can kind of solve maybe some of that Jackson stuff or some of that other questions of like, you know, people maybe bringing in the wrong version of something or bringing in duplicate versions of it. By kind of having a lot of these bundled libraries out there, you can kind of offer that to them to where they're not going to have to go out there and make those changes, though you can also still bring in a different version if for some reason maybe that version doesn't match without having to build. But also with a bundled library is you can kind of run into the same issue of having this all these shared libraries where they have like all these hard dependencies together, which can be kind of frustrating. So you can provide defaults that can also be overridden, or some stuff that is also there but doesn't necessarily have to be configured on. And a lot of that can be done with conditional on, for example, machine being class, property, resources, a bunch of other ones also. And you can also then do auto configurations as well. And so, you know, I've been again at organizations that have done this where, okay, we have like a web logging library and a batch logging library, and because we can never ever, you know, do copy and pasting, we're going to put all the common code up in a shared library. So now, you know, we have these three libraries that we have to kind of like with the parent build files we have to maintain when we make a change to, you know, shared library up here. But then that of course means we're going to have to make an update to the web logging library, the batch logging library. But what you could do is just have conditional on web application, and that way, if that application that you're pulling this logging library in, only when it's actually an actual web application will like these web logging contexts be kicked in, and if it's not, then it's just not going to bother with them at all. And similarly, also, if it's not a web application, and like I said, this conditional on can be also looking for specific classes or specific themes within the context or on the class path. So instead of having to have this, you can just actually have a single logging library, and then if you're using a web application and you're doing logging, you know, you use those conditional tags to do whatever makes sense for web logging in your organization or batch logging or whatever those things make sense, depending upon what sort of things you're looking for, you can use those conditional annotation tags. All right, so that gets a little bit to the management. Yes?
But that makes every application coupled to your logging library or whatever library you're going to invent. Isn't it like an anti-pattern against microservices? You want one service which does one thing and not coupling all of them together with client libraries?
But you're going to have, I mean, I just offered that as an example since logging is a somewhat common thing, but you're going to have like cross-cutting concerns, like security or maybe database connectivity and stuff like that across your organization, and you would probably want to put that stuff within a shared library that has like easy to understand defaults for whatever maybe your organization is doing, that you can kind of share. So, like I said, I just use logging as an example, but there's probably going to be other things in the organization that make examples where you have like a cross-cutting concern where, you know, maybe like again security or something like that. You know, maybe like the security is like just knowing where to call out to for authentication, where you kind of have that information stored in there. Does that make sense? Or yeah.
Is it a sort of trade-off that you're making? Because if you have a lot of web applications, then every web application has to have the special annotations, which would otherwise not be necessary.
Well, so like these annotations would be stored within the shared library. You're not forcing the developers or the library that's bringing it in to add these annotations. So you can put, sorry, and I didn't make that clear enough. This information, this would all be within the actual shared library. And then this configuration would only come into effect when it's an actual web application or batch application, or again, whatever it would make sense. Like I said, you have a bunch of different things. You could have like class or by some sort of property maybe, if it makes sense, bean type, so on. You can have these things being checked within the shared library and like, oh, okay, so this application is talking to our Postgres database, and for that reason, we need these kind of configurations to be working then. All right, so yeah, pre project management a little bit. So how can you also improve project initialization? And we can also kind of get ideas from then also on how to make sure people are also keeping on the correct versions of whatever maybe all these shared libraries that we're kind of building are out there. And so one of the things is we can do customizing initializer, and also you can build a wizard application to kind of guide project initialization. Or did you get that last? Okay. And then goals. So we want to guide developers towards making the right choices, and we also want to kind of reduce that work and mental burden around project initialization. And we also want to ensure projects, when they're initialized or started up, that they're consistent, properly, and fully. So that way we have consistent patterns, we can understand them across the organization, and there's like not some critical aspect missing and something like that as well. So we've all, over, of course, you've been to Josh's long presentation, you've heard of like start.spring.io, but you can also do start.myorg.com or .io or whatever it might be. So this is a bit older now. I need to kind of update this since they've redone Spring Initializer. But Spring Initializer, like all of the stuff at Pivotal, is an open source project. And while I hadn't really worked with it since they've done their update to it 2 or 3 months ago, they actually even made it easier to configure. But anyways, at the time I took the older Spring Initializer project and brought it down, and like I reconfigured it to be like, you know, obviously I changed it to like your corporate initializer, and then like I made changes to where, you know, instead of like the standard libraries that Spring puts out there, which are of course, you know, maybe exist at a higher abstraction level, you know, you could have here your security library that makes sense for your organization there as a selection. So when a person's starting, they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I'm going to use security. And of course, maybe security may be standard, so you don't bother with it. But like, you know, not everyone's going to be doing database connectivity. But if they're going to be doing that, instead of having to go and look at some other place within your organization, like, okay, wait, what's the library I need for doing database work? When they're starting it up, they just, you know, click a checkmark box or search for it, you know, just like they could here, and just bring that into their project. And all of this is governed through a YAML file. I'm pretty sure it's still a YAML file, even with the new one, where you can just, you know, kind of declare the versions and so on, and the locations and the names of the libraries all through here. And then what's great is that if you're using a project like Spring Cloud Config, has people heard of Spring Cloud Config here? Or so just really quick, Spring Cloud Config is, you can set it up to where it can read from, by default, it's a Git repository, but it can be any kind of repository or file system or even a database, whatever you want to be, but like a Git repository, where you can kind of keep this information like this. And then you can have client applications that can then call out to this configured application on some whatever basis, like I think it's 5 minutes by default. And if that's been changed since then, it will bring in those new properties. And why this can be particularly interesting here is that as versions change for like whatever shared relies on the repository, or maybe you're updating to a newer version of like the Spring Boot libraries, you can just update it all here. That's going to be updated and pulled in by your Spring Starter project. And then you're not going to make any changes, not going to bring it down or anything. Whenever someone then later goes and starts like a new project here, they're going to be bringing in the most recent versions of those libraries. So that's a way to make things a lot easier from that architectural perspective. So yeah, that kind of mostly gets to the end of this presentation. It's a little bit of a shorter one. But I would definitely recommend actually I have a couple other things I kind of want to show off for code. But I would definitely recommend going out and just checking out the actual Spring projects out on the GitHub repositories, because there's a lot of things you can kind of learn from how they go and set them up that could be useful for your organization. Also check out the Spring Starter Initializer project. And to the thing on the Wizard application, I'm still kind of working on the good code example for that. But check out that YouTube link. A couple of years ago, a couple of developers from a grocery chain in the US called Kroger, they were talking about how they were working on and putting together a Wizard application that kind of steps you through saying like, okay, like, so that Spring Initializer project, it also has a bunch of RESTful APIs. You can like call those in, and like you can say like, okay, I'm starting up a new project, and it, you know, says what it's going to do, and then like it'll, you know, add like a GitHub repository, maybe like issue trackers, and you know, adding stuff out to like a database, and you know, whatever kind of makes sense. You know, maybe setting up your like a CI/CD pipeline to production. It will get that stuff all configured and set up for you as you're going through the initialization process. You don't have to go through and do that all manually. Again, kind of the point of saving some of that mental capacity. But a couple other things I want to show you. I'm kind of working on some code examples for this. But some of the stuff you can kind of also do is like when you're working in a properties file, like, you know, if you're doing like spring.datasource, like it can give you examples of what you want to do, and it can also kind of explain like what it's doing. But you can actually also implement that feature yourself. Here I'm just doing the useless data source, and you know, it does like the exact same thing. Actually, I forgot to update that. But like for here also, I have like the useless data source type, and you know, the really useless one where you can kind of, you know, give farther explanation or for something like that. Also, I think URL. Of course, it doesn't actually work. The demo gods are angry. But what you similarly could do is, and this is all kind of configured through here. So like I created, for example, just basically like like a starter library for like doing database work. And to kind of make it easier when it comes to configuring, maybe you have a data source wrapper at your organization for whatever reason. Just again, a lot of organizations I've been to kind of have a wrapper for some reason or something like that. You can set up under meta-env Spring Cloud Configuration meta.json, and that way, when people are configuring it, you can provide tips and guidance on the different values and stuff they can set for it. And again, here is like for like database, like, you know, all within this like logging starter, like conditional on if there's a data source being in the application context, then whatever would make sense for like logging, database logging configuration. Maybe you want to log every SQL file or command going through. You know, you kind of set up that database configuration within here. And kind of like I was showing also with web logging, you know, you can, if it's a web application, then of course we're going to need to do different things based upon that. But again, this is a way to lessen, instead of having to divide up like a web logging starter or bash logging starter or whatever different kind of one, you can just kind of combine it all together, and these things will only get kicked off within it. And there's also like the optional true tag within Maven. I'm pretty sure there's an analog within Gradle. So that way, you know, to reference data source class within my logging class, I needed this starter data JDBC. But by bringing in web logging starter, or this card sharing logging starter, you're not forcing someone to also bring in this Spring Boot starter JDBC with it. It's only there in a one set of version. If they're also doing data work within that, we would have to declare it explicitly. So that's just some ways to kind of lessen the load, make things a little bit easier by following some Spring Boot's ideas. So, but any more questions or on? Or, yeah.
Not this specifically, but I was wondering, Spring is opinionated, and it's, as you said, it's easy to overrule those opinions, in my experience as well, but I haven't had that much experience yet. I was wondering, have you encountered any situations where it wasn't that easy to override an opinion of Spring, where you thought, hey, I really need this?
I think some of the closest would be, and I think this is like some of the older versions of Spring Security, where, and I can't remember quite the specifics, but it was very frustrating where I wanted to do something a bit different from what they were wanting me to do, and it was really painful to make that change. I can't quite remember the specifics, and I think that was like also Spring Security 4.x, but I think they also have improved it since then, I'm pretty sure. But generally I've found it pretty easy, but it's also one of those things I know of, and that is one time. I think it's also been a couple other small times where this is the way they wanted to do it, but I need to do something other, and it was a bit difficult to change it. Any other? Did I kind of get to maybe your question, or did anything kind of? No. Sorry. So what?
When I look to the reference manuals of Spring, they don't have any migration steps required.
Oh, so like migrating from like Spring 1 to Spring 2?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I think they have. I thought they had some documentation on it.
To migrate?
For migration. Yeah. I'm pretty sure they at least had one for Spring Boot, like 1.x and 2.x. Some of the cheap. Yeah.
They just mentioning the ones that you don't need, that can break your change. So they specified you need to change this configuration, make it like this, and they have this kind of thing.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny. I wrote a blog article about a month ago now, and it's how you can use multiple data sources within a Spring Boot application. And it's something that really I actually did some research that, because when I first wanted to do that like 2 or 3 years ago, there was like no documentation on how to do that. So I didn't bother to check since I had that idea, and so I was writing it. Then I find out there's a bunch of examples out there. So after I kind of wrote my article, I was looking at another example. I'm like, oh, this is a little bit better than the way I was doing it, but when I tried to implement it in my code, it wasn't working. And so, to keep the story short, is I kind of ran into an issue where this older article was using Spring 1.x, but in Spring 2.x, there was like a subtle change where the code API was pretty much all the same, and all the code was kind of still working, but the configuration changes are a little bit different because they're using a different data source underlying it. And the big story from that is I actually even write another article where using like automated testing can be a really great way as you're upgrading. If you have a really good automated testing suite, you can maybe catch some of those configuration and little subtle changes like that, and that way you can like upgrade with confidence. I'll just touch a little bit more on that in the next presentation. So, other questions? Or, yeah.
Yeah, so you said that at least at your company you have your own preference then for a certain library. However, if you're doing it from the thing you are suggesting then is that you reinvent your own company Spring Boot actually. Because if you keep following Spring Boot and they say, yeah, we want this version instead, and your company wants that other version, you need to port all the code that is incompatible with the other version.
No, I wasn't really so much suggesting that as maybe, so Spring Boot exists at a very high abstraction level of solving things that are being generally cross-cutting concerns for across the entire organization. However, kind of with that then is for whatever at your organization, there's going to be certain things where, okay, we want to kind of extend upon that, here because we definitely always know we're going to be using like this specific database version and stuff like that. So instead of kind of forcing all of our developers to go and make the choice of like, okay, I'm going to be using Spring Data or Spring Data C, and then I'm going to be bringing in whatever data sources, like extend off of that, create like an extended version of Spring Boot JDBC or Spring Data JDBC that brings that in, brings in maybe what the database and maybe whatever cross-cutting concern for database stuff. So it's extending upon kind of maybe what Spring Boot is doing.
Yeah, I like the idea, but indeed you will definitely have sometimes, you might have issues when Spring already went a version up, but you for your company have to stay at the lower versions for other reasons maybe. And then you want to also migrate with the latest Spring Boot version and you have to support the older library, so it could cause maybe some extra migration issues then.
Yeah, but you would still kind of have those issues anyways without that, and you would still have that extra issue of kind of allowing people to always have to then select the different versions of it. So that concern is completely valid. It's just that if you're using Spring Boot anyways, that would be a concern. It's just that with this, you kind of have something that kind of addresses some of the other concerns around providing guidance for developers on how to do things. So,
Okay.
Yeah. So this talks about Spring Boot. What was your perspective like alternative frameworks like Micronauts?
I've only just kind of read a little bit about Micronaut. I've only read a little bit about Microprofile. They offer things. I know Micronaut, their really big push is that they're going to be really great for performance. That they're offering really great startup times. I haven't spent enough time with them to really give my opinion other than I've just heard their marketing blurbs and stuff like that, and I've seen a couple of presentations on Micronaut, but I really couldn't provide probably any more than maybe what you already know on that. So.
Any more questions?
Sorry?
Any more questions?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Waiting for this one.
Yeah. Any more questions, or we'll take a break and then you can get ready for the next presentation in Unit 5.
Yeah, cool.